and welcome to Teaching Natural. My name's Dare. I'm a 6th year high school English teacher in SoCal or Southern California. And this video is the third video in my professional development series. The book we are focusing on is I Read It But I Don't Get It by Cris Tovani. Tovani was a practicing teacher when she wrote the book, so it is based off of her experience teaching reading. And the book was published in 2000. So a little things might be outdated. We might have some new research, but the strategies and the experience she talks about in the book are still relevant, still sound, even going on 23, 24 years later. So let's talk about why I chose this book. Number one, I never struggled as a reader. I was always a very strong reader, and a lot of that is because of my middle class privilege. I had Hooked on Phonics. I had books in the home. My parents read to me. I went to private school. So I have always been both naturally gifted in reading and in English, but also I had a family system that could reinforce my gifts with reading, using larger vocabulary and using reading strategies. And so I noticed as a teacher, I really struggled to teach reading strategies because as a good reader, and Tovani will define what a good reader is, and I'll talk about that in the book summary. As a good reader, I internalized the strategies and never remembered having to be taught how to use those strategies. So I wasn't very good at teaching struggling readers how to learn to read because I didn't have that experience. I was ignorant of the experience of having to read or having to struggle to learn how to read. The next reason that I chose the book is because my bachelor's program was focused on teaching English to secondary students. So that is 6th grade to 12th grade. My credential program was a single subject credential program focused on secondary. So again, 6th to 12th grade. There is an assumption that by 6th grade and necessarily when they get to me in high school, students already know how to read. So in my programs, I was never taught how to teach a student to read. Okay. So combined with my upbringing plus my credential program, assuming that students already knew how to read, I was really struggling teaching kids how to read, and I did not understand the plight of a struggling student. Then, to combine all of that, the pandemic happens. Students come back, and my students tested at a 5th grade reading level, average, which makes sense because 5th grade was their last normal year. It was the last year before we went into quarantine, before we started doing distance/online/ asynchronous learning, whatever your school happened to call it. So the issue of students not being able to read, and really 4th grade is a very critical year. You have the 4th grade slump where students switch from learning how to read to now they have to read to learn. The pandemic messed me up. And so I kept finding myself saying, my students should be able to, they should know how to do this, they should know how to read this, but they didn't. And so I chose this book because I needed to figure out, okay, they don't know how to do this. How are you going to teach them to do this? And then last year found this book, and it was the best reading strategies / professional development book that I have ever read. So let's get into the book summary to talk about what is in this magnificent book. Like I said earlier, Tovani was a struggling reader who became a reading specialist and talks about her own experiences teaching reading to students who were quote unquote behind in where they should be or not on grade level while they're reading. So this book really does focus on teaching, in the title, adolescent or secondary readers, which was fantastic because a book that was based on teaching elementary schoolers to read was not going to talk about the more advanced comprehension and the experiences that adolescent readers bring to reading that is different than an elementary school reader. So it's really great that this book focuses specifically on practical strategies to apply to adolescent 6th through high school age students. First, Tovani starts off with kind of a history of teaching reading with her workshops. She does talk about STEM, which is really great because a lot of times reading books will talk only from the English perspective and not from teaching students how to read in a specific content area. We also find that that puts a lot of pressure on English teachers to teach students how to read for every single context, which is just, it's unrealistic. Like, one teacher cannot handle that whole burden. So before those Common Core standards really were adopted, Tovani was writing about how every subject, that teacher is a literacy teacher. It is everybody's duty to make sure that every student knows how to read in that content area. So Tovani kind of defines what a good reader is versus a bad reader, and I'm paraphrasing here. A good reader is someone who, when they struggle with reading, they have multiple strategies and they know what strategy to use to help them read. A bad reader is a student who doesn't have a strategy or doesn't know when to apply a certain strategy and then gives up. So it isn't necessarily about the aptitude of what a student is born with. It's more about what does a student do when they struggle. And that's where Tovani focuses on the teaching practice. How do we give readers strategies to break down the information and help themselves read? And then also, how do we teach them when to use certain strategies when one strategy won't work, but another strategy will work better? Some ideas of the strategies that she talks about is asking questions that focus on where a student is struggling. She has this idea that a stupid question is only a question that you already know the answer to. That's the only kind of idea of a stupid question. But asking these harder, deeper questions that don't have an immediate answer and making students feel comfortable asking questions is one reading strategy to help struggling readers. The next reading strategy is making inferences. So looking at the text, using textual evidence to come up with educated opinions on what they think is happening or what might happen in the text. To add on to the inferences, it's not just necessarily what the text is saying, but also using a student's background knowledge and context to inform their inference, and then kind of examining where that background knowledge is coming from and why that background knowledge is making them think of these certain inferences. The next strategy that she talks about is visualization. So creating that picture in your mind of what's going on. She then talks about noticing the voices when we read. And so she says that readers have two voices. The first is the recitation voice. This is the voice that's just reading the words and sounding out the sounds as we read. The second voice is our conversational voice. This is the voice that is going in the background that is making the connections to the text. Something like, oh, this is how I would handle that situation. Oh my gosh, I can't stand this character because this character is doing X, Y, Z. Oh, I remember reading about this or seeing this in a movie, and I wonder if that came from. All of those meaning-making things that go on in a reader's head, that is the conversational voice. And so Tovani's strategy is teaching students to understand when their conversational voice stops. When they've lost that conversational voice, that's when they are no longer understanding what they're reading. That's where they're no longer making meaning. So you have to go back to that point where it was just your recitation voice talking. She provides examples of common issues with student comprehension and students' learned helplessness. So when they say, oh, I'm just a bad reader, so I give up. Not because the student is a bad student, but because usually they've tried the one strategy that they know. It's usually sounding out the words. So way to go, first grade / kindergarten teachers. Like, you're killing it with sounding out the words. These kids know how to do that. And so Tovani says, when they try that strategy and that strategy fails and the student gives up and refuses to try a new strategy, that's kind of that learned helpless idea. But our job as a teacher is to model these different strategies when we notice that this might be a part where a student's conversational voice stops talking, or when we're reading, hey, my conversational voice stopped talking, I need to go back here because I didn't understand something there. The last kind of idea that is a reading strategy necessarily is making specific connections with other subjects and relevant events. There are kind of three main things that Tovani has the students do. It's a connection to the text, so text to text, something else you've read. That also includes media, so something they might have watched or a video game or listened to. Text to self, which is usually the first thing she has them do, is where do they see themselves in the experience of these characters or the experience of this event. And then finally, text to world. What are the bigger things that are happening in the world that you can see, oh, the text is matching here. And so making those specific connections is kind of her go-to strategy. It's a really great one. And then if those strategies seem to fail, then she helps students understand, okay, what other strategy might be better off. I think one of the great things about the book is that she shares her teaching experience, the conversations she's having with kids, what questions she's asking them, how the students are responding, and most importantly, she shares the times when she fails. And by fails, it just means that lesson didn't work. She had to approach it from a different angle, or a student didn't necessarily buy into the way she explained it. And I think that is so important because a lot of times the professional development books will focus on when the strategy works, and that's all you see. You don't see, yikes, didn't do my best teaching that day. And Tovani is completely transparent of when she's like, yeah, this wasn't my best, or this strategy, I didn't teach that right. I had to go back and reteach it. Or, you know what, I missed this one kid. Hopefully by the time they graduated high school, or hopefully sometime in their life, they understood it, but I just couldn't get that kid. And so that was the kind of summary breakdown of the main key points in the book. So let's go to how I applied this in my classroom and how I'm going to continue to apply this in my classroom. The first thing that I'm going to do, and it's the first thing that Tovani does, is with class expectations, asking students what they think a good reader is, and then giving students what that actual definition is of a good reader. A good reader is someone who, when they notice that they're struggling, they're using their strategies and they're not giving up. That's what a good reader is. I really like that idea because it cements that effort is a part of reading, and it also does not exclude the students who are already good readers, like doesn't make them feel bad about it.
Editing dare here. My camera fell over, so I didn't get to finish my thought. But that definition from Tovani helps struggling readers understand that there is growth mindset and that reading is a skill that with the right strategies and practice and effort, you can get better at it and they can succeed at it.
After we talk about what a good reader is, I'm then going to do another activity that Tovani does at the beginning of the year, and that's asking students to list what they read in a day. And there are going to be things on there that students don't actually notice, like, oh yeah, I do read. Like when I watch a TikTok and it has the text, that's something they read. I'm also going to participate in this activity because I'm going to talk about the things that as an adult, these are things I have to read, and these are things you're going to have to read, like a voting ballot or, your taxes. You're going to have to read the forms. You're going to have to know how to make meaning from those. Articles that you see in your life, just all kinds of things that we have to read, like signs when you're driving, that we don't consciously notice that we're reading, but we are reading. The next thing I picked up is modeling my reading experience. And this isn't revolutionary in that, like, I've heard that this is helpful, but I've always struggled with, well, if I say what I'm seeing, are students just going to regurgitate what I said? But I'm going to give it a try of using my own personal experience. And I know one thing that I don't have to worry about my students kind of regurgitating is when I was first reading, what was something I was getting stuck on and how I made meaning, and just vocalizing that process of how I made meaning, the strategies that I used that I internally know to use, and at some point in my life learned how to use them, calling those out so that students can see how to apply them and how to use them. And I think if I model it that way, I won't necessarily have so much of students kind of regurgitating the analysis or the reasoning that I do. So that's something I'm going to work on. I'm also going to focus on questioning and students sharing at the beginning of the year. So on the, third or fourth day when I do my syllabus, pulling out those questions as they're reading the syllabus and as they're taking notes, so that we start off from the moment they begin reading in my classroom, calling out these strategies and working on these strategies. I'm going to work on even more explicit drawing of their background. So those text to self connections and asking them, oh, how are you making meaning from this? But also when they are reasoning, drawing out, like, it seems like you are thinking of something or thinking of XYZ. Is there some personal experience you've had that makes you think? And then letting students bring in their personal experience and seeing that that is a form of helping them make meaning with their reading. And then obviously, again, modeling my experience. One thing I forgot to explicitly name in the book summary is when the conversation voice stops, Tovani calls that the point of confusion. That's the point where a student got confused. And so Tovani uses the strategy of putting a sticky note or specifically highlighting, like, right here is where I got confused. I am going to more intentionally make students do that. I used to make them put a question next to it, and I'm still probably going to do that, but I like the idea of highlighting and sticky notes. I just like that. It's a little bit more visual. Let's see. Last year, I more specifically taught inference, and then this year, it'll be the second time more specifically teaching what an inference is. I'm gonna do better on that because teaching inference is actually a lower level standard. It's not a 9th grade standard because, again, the standard is assuming that a student already knows how to do that. But I'm gonna go back, I think it's a 5th grade standard, or it might, at this point, it might even be a 3rd grade standard. I'm gonna go back to wherever that lower standard is, and I am going to explicitly teach how to make inferences rather than simply assuming that a student knows how to make an inference and guiding them through that process. And then the last thing that I have is how I'm gonna apply this in my classroom is, again, modeling what I do as a reader, more so than just asking the basic comprehension questions of what's going on, what's this character's motivation, what is this thing or that thing, more modeling, like, I'm seeing XYZ, this is making me think that XYZ. Now that I've talked about how I've already applied it in my classroom / how I'm going to continue to work on the application, let's wrap it up and move on to the next book. In summary of all of this, I think this book is the best reading strategies PD book that I have read. I think it was just fantastic. It was so easy to understand and comprehend. And again, it really did put me into that situation that I was ignorant of. I had no knowledge. I had no experience of how to teach a struggling reader because I wasn't a struggling reader. And Tovani does an excellent job of helping me have empathy for my students and putting me into their shoes, and then giving me, like, here are the clear things to do to help these readers, rather than kind of it just being theory. Her book is extremely applicable and it's easy to apply. It's not hard to see, oh, day one, I know exactly how I can make my students do this thing. Or, oh, this specific lesson would be great to teach this specific reading strategy, or I can storyboard to help them visualize. And again, with this idea of it's great for teaching reading, that means it can apply to English as well as every other subject at the secondary level, which again, revolutionary. You don't see a whole lot of that happening. 1, teaching reading. 2, teaching reading at the secondary level. 3, a reading book that is not just for English teachers, but for all of these subjects. I really, really do wish I had come across this book during my credential program or during my bachelor's degree program, because I think I would have been so much of a better teacher. That's not the way I want to say that. I think I would have been a better teacher my first 2-3 years if I had read this book instead of, waiting till my 5th year, going into my 5th year to read this book and to really get a better grasp on how to teach reading at the secondary level. I hope this discussion of I read it, but I don't get it was very helpful. I hope there were some things that you saw that you can apply as well. And I also hope that it was helpful with me being honest about my experience reading and how that privilege that I didn't necessarily understand was a privilege when I was growing up and when I was going through the credential program has now affected me when I'm trying to teach others. So again, I hope you enjoyed this review of it, and I hope that you found something that you can apply in your own classroom. Let me know if you're going to grab this book or if you've already read it. What were your takeaways from it? I would love to continue the dialogue on this book. The next book following in the stream of reading is going to be Book Love by Penny Kittle. But in the meantime and in between time, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.